Okay, let's have one more short video in this chapter about scope. So we sort of talked about scope before when we were talking about by-val keyword, the by-val keyword, and the by-ref or by-reference keywords. Well, by-ref. And remember that when you use the by-val keyword, then if you have the variable outside the method and the same variable inside the method, whatever you do to the variable inside the method doesn't affect what you've done or what gets done to the variable outside the method, right? So that's kind of has to do with the scope or the scope of the variable inside a method. So when introducing the concept of methods, we describe them as self-contained. So a method is self-contained, right? It means that everything inside the method is sort of exists for and by itself. But actually that's not quite true. If you use the by-ref keyword, that's not quite true, right? Anyway, this has an important effect on the way variables are used and defined in methods. So imagine you have the following two methods, both of which define a variable called this. Okay, so you have two methods, both of which are going to define this variable. So here's the first method, and you can see that it declares the variable and assigns it a value. This time it assigns it a value of the string Sebastian Blackwood. Okay, and then this method also displays that variable or that string. Okay, then you have another method different than this one. This one's called display Sebastian's name, and this one was called displays Balthasar's name. And this one looks like this. Basically exactly the same thing. Declares this variable, and then but it gives it a different string here. This is Balthasar. The other one was Sebastian. So the string is different, but other than that it's the same. And then again we're just going to display it. Okay, so let's look at this. So here it is in Visual Studio, the same thing. String name is Blackwood, Sebastian Blackwood. String name is Balthasar Keach. We have two different methods. Now we're going to go up here and we're going to, in our button, we're going to call one of the methods. We're going to call this one, display Balthasar's name. This one. So we should get this, and the fact that we have another method here that just defines string name by this doesn't matter, because this method, first of all, is not called, and second of all, even if it were called, if we call this one afterwards, then the string is redefined and it's reassigned this value. So actually what happens is when you call a method, the variables inside the method are created. Okay, and if they exist somewhere else, they're created just inside the method, and that they only have that you create a new copy of a variable. Suppose you had another variable that was assigned prior to calling the method. Still, when you call the method, which is what I'm going to do, you define basically a new variable inside the method, and it only exists inside the method, and it's created when you call this method, and when this method is finished, that new copy gets destroyed. So actually I added in, from his example, I added in a little bit extra here. He didn't have this line. So what I've done is I have, this is a button click, and I did the same thing here. We have, well, I'm sorry, I added both of these lines in. So here I'm creating the variable outside of the method and assigning it this value. Okay, but I'm calling this method, and this method down here we'll assign it this method. So the question is, when I do the message box, which one am I going to see? Am I going to see this, or am I going to see this? And then afterwards, I added another piece, which is here. I'm going to do a message box after this gets displayed. So the question would be, once this one runs, so then we would think that this has been assigned to this. So now, after that happens, what's going to happen when I run this message box? Because we would think that string name has been assigned this, even though earlier in the button click method I assigned string name this, right? But then I ran this, which assigns string name this. So if I now do message box, shouldn't string name be this? But no, remember, the scope of this variable is only within the method, and once the method has finished running, this gets destroyed. It's like it's created a new variable, and then it gets destroyed, even though the variable has the same name as the one outside the method. Okay, so what's going to happen is when the second message box is also going to display string name. Has string name been changed from this to this because I ran that method? The answer will be no. Let's check it. So what I want to check is, first of all, when I run this, what am I going to see for the string name? And it's going to be this. Okay, but the second message box I see is still going to display string name, and string name has been reassigned to this value, it appears, but no, it's just going to show this. Okay, so what happens in here is just local to this method. That's the way they describe it. Okay, so the first time I expect to see what? Balthasar. Okay? And the second time, you might think I'm going to see Balthasar again because I have redefined the value of string name. But no, this string name here is not affected by what happened in the method. So if I click OK, I see this one, Sebastian Blackwood. Okay, so this illustrates the idea of scope. So he says, even though both of these methods use a variable with the same name, the self-contained feature of methods means that it is perfectly practicable and the variable names won't affect each other. Okay, so this is a little bit different than the concept of by ref and by val, because here we don't have any input variables, so it's a little bit different. But basically, it's about whether the variables change their values. If they're changed within a function, does the value outside of the function get changed? So he says, this exercise illustrates that even though you've used the same variable name in two separate places, he didn't put it outside of, he didn't use the variable outside of the methods like I did, the program still works as intended. He says a little bit more. When a method starts running, the variables defined within that method, in other words, between sub and end sub, or between function and end function, are given what's called local scope. The scope defines which part of the program can see the variable, and the local specifically means within the current method. So our variables can only be seen within the current method, not by if we mention that same variable name outside of the method, it doesn't matter. The variable outside of the method can't see the variable within the method. This variable technically doesn't even exist until the method starts running. Well, in my example it exists because I defined it outside as well. But if not, then this variable technically doesn't exist until the method starts running. At this point, .NET and Windows allocate memory to the variable so that it can be used in the code. First you set the value, and then you display the message box. So we first set the value, and then we displayed it. Therefore, in this case, as you're calling the method display Balthasar's name, the variable is created the moment the method is called. The variable is created the moment the method is called. You run the code in the method that alters the newly created version of string name, or it assigns it a value. And then when the method has finished, the variable is actually deleted. Like Windows deletes that variable or takes away that reserved memory for it. As you will see in chapter 4, you will see in chapter 4 that scope can even be limited to loops within your subroutines and functions. So you can have a variable which only has scope within your loop, even though you might have a function or a method that has a loop in it, and you have a variable that's created inside the loop, then that variable only has scope within that loop. So you might use that variable out, or you can limit it if you want to, and then you might have that variable outside of the loop but still within the method, and that variable won't be seen within and without. In other words, they'll be separated. Okay. So let's just read the summary. This chapter introduces the concept of writing software, not just for Visual Basic 2010, but also for all programming languages. We started by using the concept of an algorithm, the underpinnings of all computer software. We then introduced the concept of variables and looked closely at the most commonly used data types: integer, double, string, date, and Boolean. You saw how you could use these data types to perform operations like plus, minus, and so on, such as mathematical operations and concatenating strings, returning the length of a string, splitting text into substrings, retrieving the current date, extracting date properties. You then looked at how variables are stored in the computer. Okay, so that is the end of this very important chapter. And next we will go to arrays, which is actually, I think, chapter 5 in this book. Okay, so don't forget that we have already done loops, right? That was chapter 4. So you should remember the important loops that we did, like the for loop and the for each loop and the do while loop and the do until loop and so on. You should remember those. And what we're going to do, if you remember, in the for each loop, we actually looped through the directories, or I'm sorry, looped through a directory to look at its subdirectories, if you recall. And that was actually using an array. So we're going to study arrays next. And basically, it's very simple to explain what an array is. It's just a list. And everybody makes lists all the time. You probably made a list today about things you wanted to do or something like that. So a list is a very useful thing, and it's going to be equally as useful when you're programming. So you'll store many similar things in a list, and then you'll use that list. So that's what we're going to do next time.